in special partnership with and brought to you by our friends at FLYN. Today on Soulfront, where we explore personal, social, and workforce transformation, we have Jeannie Gainsburg, an educational trainer, consultant in the field of LGBTQ plus inclusion and effective allyship. Formerly the educational director at the Out Alliance in Rochester, New York, she has personally facilitated more than 500 training sessions and workshops in more than 20 different states at corporations, colleges, government agencies, K-12 schools, hospitals, faith communities, and much more. In January 2019, Jeannie received a citation from the New York State Assembly for Distinguished Educational and Human Rights Services for her work in promoting LGBTQ plus rights and inclusion. And in 2020, Jeannie released her first book, The Savvy Ally, a guide for becoming a skilled LGBTQ plus advocate. Today, we're going to discuss Jeannie's new book and dig into the topic of the Savvy Ally. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Thanks so much for taking the time. Welcome to the show. Just a quick introduction of yourself. You are an educational trainer, consultant in the field of LGBTQ inclusion and effective allyship, formerly the education director of the Out Alliance in Rochester, New York. You personally facilitated more than 500 sessions and workshops in about 20 states. And in 2019, you received a citation from New York State Assembly for the Distinguished Educational and Human Rights Services for your work in promoting LGBTQ rights and inclusion. In 2020, you released your first book, The Savvy Ally, a guide for becoming a skilled LGBTQ advocate. Yay! And today we're going to, discuss the book and dig into the topic of the Savvy Ally. So Jeannie, just thanks so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here.
Yeah, so the topic of the Savvy Ally is about becoming a skilled LGBTQ advocate. And the book is an excellent source and resource for leaders, teachers, parents, and so many more. Jeannie, can you begin with the origin story of your book and its title?
Sure, yeah. So when I first started my journey as an ally, it was about 20 years ago. I was supportive of LGBTQ plus people prior to that, but I would not have called myself an ally. I didn't actually know the word. Didn't have any connections into the community that I knew of. No close friends who identified as LGBTQ plus, no family members. And so I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. And so when I did first start 20 years ago, I knew absolutely nothing. I mean, I actually called our local agency, the Out Alliance, and asked if I could volunteer. And in my very first session, I was the one who had to raise my hand and ask what, at the time, GLBT stood for, because I had no idea. So that gives you some idea of my knowledge base. I was not the Savvy Ally when I first started, as of course none of us are, because we are all learning and on a journey. And what I really, really wanted, because I repeatedly made mistakes and messed up and used the wrong term or an outdated term, and inadvertently I was, again, using terms that were not up to date. And what I really wanted was a guidebook. I wanted a guidebook that said, say this, don't say this. And, here are some actions that you can do that are going to create change. That book didn't exist. So you can tell where I'm going with this. 20 years in the future after being the education director at the Out Alliance, and which basically put me in charge of training all of our speakers and crafting all of our workshops and writing all of the curriculum, I really felt like I had that knowledge to provide that for other folks who were in my shoes, just feeling like they want to be supportive, but they're just scared to death. And I meet so many people like that. They're so afraid that they're going to say something offensive that they're actually silenced, and they're worried about stepping up and saying things because they're afraid they're going to make a mistake. So that was the book I wanted to create. Took a quick look to see, not a quick look. I took a look to see what was out there, to see if that book existed when it came time for me when I was deciding to write it. And it really didn't. The book that I envisioned was not out there. And there are books out there for allies, but I really wanted one that was really, really accessible for one thing. So I didn't want it to be like a heavy academic book,
Mhm.
queer theory 501 kind of thing. I really wanted it to be an easy read, an easy to understand read. And I wanted it to be very, very encouraging and forgiving. And what I mean by that is, to me, being an ally is just an ongoing journey of messing up,
Mhm.
making an appropriate apology, forgiving ourselves, and then moving forward to get it right the next time. And it's just repeat over and over and over. And so I really wanted a book that helped people understand that you're going to make mistakes. It's not if, it's when. And it really is just a matter of how do we recover gracefully and then move forward. The title of the book, I just thought it was kind of fun. I actually had two publishers interested in my book, which was very flattering. One of them wanted to name it something like, a guide for becoming an LGBTQ plus ally or something. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really roll off your tongue. I wanted something that people could, hey, have you read The Savvy Ally? Savvy, of course, meaning knowledgeable, experienced. And so I liked the title. And then when it came time to create a website, I actually went with Savvy Ally Action, because I didn't want people assuming that I was saying that I was the savvy ally. It's kind of like, Dear Abby, like I know everything. I don't, I'm on a journey myself. And so to me, it's all about us all trying to become as savvy as possible. But I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm implying I'm the savvy ally. So
Yeah, no, in your book, it has us think of the word ally as a compliment, like something that you earn with your actions. In that you said that is kind of the title, part of the of your title in your website. It's not like an identity that gives you privileges, and also that you need to be mindful of the fact that you might be a part of an LGBTQ movement, but that doesn't mean you're a part of the community.
correct.
Like, what does the word ally mean and not mean to you?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that's an important distinction. And um, I have a little trouble with sort of talking about ally as a gift that someone gives you in a way as a compliment, as opposed to a label, because I use it. It's in the title of my book. I call myself an ally. It's really hard to navigate the world without actually using the word ally. It's descriptive. People understand it. So I do use the word. I do encourage people to wear ally buttons. It's more a mindset to me. So I think an ally button is important, right? It really has visibility there, and it shows people like I'm supportive. I'm interested in advocating for this community. But to me, it's a mindset. Don't think about yourself as an ally in a way that like, well, I'm an ally, so therefore it's okay for me to do this. Like if you're starting a sentence like that, you're doing it wrong. It's really something that again, like if anyone ever says to me like you're a great ally, I'm like wow, like that, thank you, it's a huge compliment. So I think we've never arrived. We're never like that's it, we're done, I'm the perfect ally. It's a constant journey. And I think it's also important to state that within the LGBTQ plus community context, people, when they hear ally, they think about the straight cisgender person or the straight person who's not transgender, if you're not familiar with that word. But I think I like to think about ally very broadly. So to me, everyone can be an ally to a marginalized community. And so, for example, a cisgender gay man can be an ally to the trans community, right? They have different issues there, different concerns. They're being marginalized in different ways. And, even a trans individual, a white trans man can be an ally to trans women of color, for example. So I, right off the bat, early in my book, share that ally to me is a very broad word. I don't want people to think, well, this book isn't for me because I'm part of the community. It's actually been one of the wonderful feedback pieces that I've been getting from people who are part of the community and have been saying, like, I can't believe how much I learned. Like I only kind of knew about my identity. So I find that very, very flattering when people within the communities read my book and are still learning things about how to be an ally.
Yeah, you talked about it kind of the beginning of our conversation, how when you started, you were volunteering at the Out Alliance Center, and then you had 20 years of experience. Can you tell us a little bit more about the experience becoming the education director for the Out Alliance?
Yeah, sure. So well, I'll sort of back up to before my first phone call when I called that agency. As I said, like LGBTQ plus equality and inclusion was always just kind of a no-brainer, but I hadn't done anything about it. And then in 2003, there were a lot of things coming together for me. 2003 found me, I had worked outside of the home as a social worker educator for many years, but 2003 found me a stay-at-home mom. So I'm at home, I've got two young children, and they're just starting, my little one is just starting preschool. So I've got like a smidgen of time to like start thinking about doing something outside of the home. And I was really hungry for that work, that sort of additional work for my brain. And so I started thinking about volunteer work. That was the first thing that happened. And I wanted to do something that I felt really good telling my kids about. You know, I'm a parent now, and I just wanted to be proud of the work that I did. And I wanted to be something that I could explain to them, like why I was doing the work that I was doing. Marriage equality was newly kind of in the news. It was sort of one of the first things that I can remember in my adult life that I really could latch onto and say like, oh, there's something I can actually fight for. You know, it was very clear, here's this thing. And so that was definitely a piece that I was like, there's an ally action that I can work towards. And then the other thing that was happening was my son was now in elementary school. And I was really shocked at the stuff that he was coming home sharing that he was hearing at school. Derogatory terms against, you know, mostly gay slurs. And I thought, oh my gosh, really? Like we're still there? I was just so surprised that, you know, I mean, again, that was happening when I was in middle school, but I'm like, oh, it's still going on. We're still being disrespectful and teasing the boys for being gay and all that stuff. And so all those things were happening at once. And then my husband gave me this book for my 40th birthday about the women's suffragette movement. And I'm reading it one night in bed thinking like, oh, if I had lived back then, I'm sure I would have, you know, been marching right alongside all these wonderful women. And it just suddenly hit me that I was being very hypocritical, that, you know, I felt strongly about this movement my whole life, basically, and I hadn't done anything about it. So the next morning, I look up the word gay in the phone book, which gives you some idea of how long ago that is, the phone book. You remember that, right?
Sure.
And I call, and I was very, very nervous because I wasn't part of the community and I wasn't sure I'd be welcome. And they embraced me with open arms. The LGBTQ plus community and the folks at the agency were just incredible. I mean, it's the guiding principle in my book is the assumption of goodwill, the assumption that people are coming from a good place and that maybe they just didn't get the memo on the most updated terms. And it really dates back to my start because I needed a lot of hand-holding. I was very nervous and people gave it to me. People were so kind and so forgiving and, you know, of all my mistakes. And I'm just so grateful. To me, being an ally and even writing this book in a way is a gift back to that community that was so kind. So anyway, quickly, I started as a volunteer. I worked at the agency for about 2.5 years, and then they hired me to sort of revamp their education program. And then my final 5 years there, I was promoted to education director. And I told you a little bit about what that entailed as well.
Yeah. Like you've talked about like many reasons to fight for progressive change in the LGBTQ community, and you know, there's the community struggles for same rights that, you know, other people take for granted. LGBTQ consistently suffer from like these microaggressions. You don't have safe spaces at schools, work, or home. You've talked about it a bit, but you know, from when you started to now, you know, what's your why for pushing for LGBTQ rights?
I want everyone to be able to live authentically in every aspect of their lives. And I see constantly people who aren't able to be authentic at all or are able to be their authentic selves at home with their friends. And then they go to work and they have to hide who they are, you know, or even with their family, and which is in some ways worse, right? They have to, you know, deny their identities because their families aren't accepting. Yeah, I just want everyone to be able to just be who they are. Just, you know, it takes so much energy to hide who you are. It is so stressful to not be your authentic self. And I have lived my whole life with that privilege and I can't even imagine it.
Yeah, no, it on the common pushback like on the LGBTQ movement, often comes from people who feel like they can't say anything anymore, like without offending somebody. That they think that we've gone too far with being politically correct, and this mentality, you know, can come without fully understanding maybe why the change is needed. Like we kind of talked about, like maybe they're just not thinking about it, or uh, people might dislike being told what to do or feel like overwhelmed by like the change that's happening. Like,
Mhm.
what can we do to offer a bridge for these folks to engage in allyship?
Yeah, I really appreciate you asking that question. It's huge. Interestingly, one of my chapters is on common pushback and how we respond to it. And at the very last minute, I threw in that exact question, the like, don't you feel like we've gone too far? I feel like I can't say anything anymore. And I was really happy that I did, because I was able to talk about how valuable connecting with people is. And so what I shared was a story about my own messing up, my own resistance to learning, if you will. It was the very first time someone told me that I should remove the word preferred when I asked for people's pronouns. So typically in a workshop, and again, this was probably like 5 or 6 years ago, we would say, please share your name, what you do, and if you feel comfortable, your preferred pronoun. And someone in a workshop said to me, the very first time, I'd really like it if you didn't use the word preferred, because preferred to me is like a choice, right? It's not a pronoun, is just sort of part of me and it's who I am. Preferred is again, it's like, well, I prefer pepperoni pizza, but I'll eat plain, right? So I, interestingly, because it was the very first time I heard it and everybody was saying preferred pronoun, I dismissed it immediately with a like, nah, right? Which is what we do. When we think about it, we are all very, very resistant learners. We have to be. We don't take new information and stick it in our brain every time we hear it. Our lives would be chaos. So this was the example I gave in my book of me having what I call my lump of knowledge, right? This knowledge base that I've created my whole life, and someone trying to add a new piece to it. And I was like, nope, which is typically what I do. I mean, it's embarrassing to admit, but I think we kind of all do. So I was able to share that experience. And then of course, now I do, as part of my education around respectful language, is I do say, just ask what people's pronouns are. Don't use the preferred, for the exact reasons that this person shared with me years ago. But because I was in that situation, and literally in my head, I'm thinking like, really, like now this, and I'm like, it's so ironic, because here I am literally, leading a
Writing the
training
book.
on respectful language, right? Can you believe it? And someone shares this tip with me and I'm like, nah. So it was just like absolutely ironic and very funny. And I was glad that I could share it in the book, because it did show like, I'm human too, we all make mistakes. But back to your question, when someone shares that with me, like, I just feel like I can't say anything anymore, it's just too much. Because I know I've had that reaction, I'm able to connect with them. And to me, that is a great way to start a conversation with someone who is resistant, if you will. I literally say, I get it. You know what? I absolutely get it. I used to feel that too, and I might even share an example, because what that does is it prevents me from being like this educator up here. Let me educate you. It's more about like, yeah, absolutely. Like I was there. I felt the same way, and kind of like, here's what I learned. And so people's ears are more likely to be open to that conversation if you start that way.
Yeah.
The other thing that I like to share with people is, they're not going to make changes that don't make sense to them. And so, obviously, taking the time to explain something, why something is being asked of them, understanding that it's a process. So like me, the first time they hear it, they may not change their language instantly. We're planting seeds, which is important when we talk about just sharing different ideas with people. And then the other thing I say, which goes back to coaching, we talked earlier about the fact that I'm a volleyball player. I'm also a coach, and it's amazing how many things there are that are similar in coaching and in education.
Mhm.
But I like to share that one tip at a time will really help people, prevent people from being overwhelmed. I talk in my book about trying to learn racquetball. I was playing with a friend who was actually very good at racquetball, and I couldn't get the game at all. And I finally just broke it down. One thing each time I played, I'm just focusing on this. So the same thing with all these words, right? I ask people to choose one language tweak that makes sense to you, or maybe it's something you use very often. Just work on that. Just let everything else go, work on that until you have that down, and then move on to another. And that really helps people from getting overwhelmed too.
Yeah, I actually with my kids and sports, it's I'm assistant coach with my son, and that's it's so true. Is just one thing at a time. Otherwise, it's chaos.
Yeah.
But like
Mhm.
other tips that you mentioned in the book for leaders engaging LGBTQ advocacy are one, relax. It's not about sex.
Right.
Two, it's actually good for business, in a workplace, if that's where what we're talking about. The three, growing pains are common. And the fourth one I really like is the silence is a loud and clear message, a message that you're not a supporter. And I want to ask, like, why are these tips for leaders so important to internalize? um yeah, why are these like these ideas about advocacy to leaders so important?
I think leaders have such a critical role in establishing climate, change in climate, if you will. I think sometimes they don't even realize how much control they have there. And I think that watching a leader, mirroring, the appropriate term, for example, it's going to change the climate of how people think. Like, let's say you have a new intern who's using the pronoun they, which a lot of people get tripped up on. A lot of people are like, what's up with this? That's not grammatically correct. Like, people get all in a tizzy over singular they. But if you have a, president of the company, whoever, who is not able to sort of handle that pronoun, misgenders this person, that's going to be the culture. Like, I guarantee it. You may have one or two folks in the employees who are a little bit more savvy and understand the importance of not misgendering people who are trying to create change from this sort of lower level, if you will. But it's a completely different situation if that leader, that president, immediately starts using the correct pronoun, messes up, of course, because we all do, apologizes appropriately, works on getting it right. People are going to change. So that's just a simple example of people really, really look up to the leaders as far as, is this going to fly? Like, is this something that I should be doing? It's so critical. And the four things that you mentioned are absolutely such important points. The it's not about sex one. Like, I can't state that enough, how important that is for leaders to understand, because it's really behind the pushback of, I don't really think it's appropriate for people to be out in the workplace. That's not an appropriate place to be sharing your orientation. It absolutely is an appropriate place to be sharing our orientation. Our orientation comes to work with us, right? We can't get rid of it. It's part of who we are. It's the sexual behaviors that don't come to work with us. So understanding that distinction of, if I talk about my wife, or I put a picture of my wife on my desk, that's what bringing my orientation to work looks like. I'm not talking about this great new sexual position that we just tried over the weekend, as I talk to my coworkers. That's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for anybody. But for some reason, there's this double standard. And I think that one is so huge for administrators and leaders to understand.
Yeah, like taking it from the workplace to leaders in the family. Like, I love how you provide practical suggestions for parents creating an LGBTQ inclusive environment. Like, just basic stuff like tell your children that you love them. Like, choose LGBTQ themed books and movies. Take a stand to support your kids. Show your pride, ungender your language. Like, from your experience, like, what are the main challenges parents have when trying to create this inclusive LGBTQ space for their children?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the things that you just mentioned, I feel like that's something that every parent should be doing, because we don't always know if our kids are LGBTQ plus. I mean, when I talk with parents, I'm like, you don't necessarily know. Sometimes they don't even know. So, create an environment where you're letting them know that you're open to them being anything, right? And no matter what they are, you're creating an environment of inclusion. But I think, yeah, for parents, there's a few things. One of the things that's a very common, I don't know if I want to call it a mistake, attitude, I guess maybe, that parents have is that my child isn't old enough to know this about themselves, or this is just a phase. All their friends are saying that they're this way, and it's just a phase or whatever. It's possible that it's a phase. I don't want to deny that sometimes teens try stuff out. They do, and people's identities change throughout lifetime as well. But the even sort of implying that this is just a phase can be really hurtful. So what I like to tell parents is, whether it's a phase or not, just respect where they are right now. Just respect it and go with it. And it may be a phase, it may not be, but verbalizing that will never be a helpful thing for that child.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting is people don't always realize that we learn, most people can identify their orientation typically around puberty. So, 13, 14, we're starting to get a sense of like who we're attracted to. Not always, but that's pretty standard. But what they don't realize is that we know our gender much earlier. So when you hear stories of like kindergartners or even younger kids that are like adamant, I am a girl or I'm a boy, they know this about themselves. Parents are like, they're way too young to know this. Gender gets solidified much, much earlier. And so it is often the preschool, kindergarten kids that we're hearing saying like, no more dresses, or, I know a lot of trans men, that was their first sentence was no more dresses. So just to, again, be aware of when our understanding of gender tends to take place versus our understanding of our orientation. And again, with some people, these things change throughout our lifetime. Either our identities change or our acceptance of them, our understanding of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Like, whether it's at school or at work or in society, you've mentioned best practices for ally action. And, you talk about ungendering language, mirroring terms, asking everyone like how you should refer to them, visibly indicating your support, like we talked about before. I'd like to go deeper on, one of these practices. Can you explain how to broach the subject of ungendering our language? You talked a little bit with the they comment and the CEO, but can you give a different example of like, if you're going into say an organization, you want to approach a group and you want to have that conversation, like, what should you be thinking about?
Ungendering language is one of my favorite tips. It's so simple. It takes you so far. I like to say, other than wearing like the big rainbow button, it's like the next best way that you can share with someone that you're open to hearing that they are anyone, any identity. I really, really love examples. So you'll actually notice in my book that I don't give a lot of technical definitions, dictionary definitions. I like to give examples of things. I think it really helps to cement concepts. So I would actually give an example of why this is so important. One example that happened to me back when I was flying on a plane pre-pandemic, I was on my way to a workshop, and the woman next to me, leans over and says, "Oh, are you stopping in Chicago? Are you continuing on?" And we got in a conversation about where we were going. And she said she was continuing on because her daughter was getting married in Denver. And I said, "Oh, like, how great. Are you happy with her choice of a partner?" And she like paused for a moment, and then she said, "I am. And I'm actually really pleased that you used the word partner, because she's marrying a woman." And I give this example in the book, and then we end up in this great conversation. She actually found out that I was the education director, and she was like, "I don't usually talk to people on planes, but you're one I wish I had talked to." They were like landing, and she's like, "Oh, it was pretty funny." But back to the ungendering terms, I think about what would that conversation have looked like had I said, "Oh, are you happy with her choice of a husband?" I'm automatically, making this assumption. And now she has to look at me and think, is this a safe person for me to share? Now, she's the parent, so it's a little bit lower risk. But, if it's about her and her identity, you're literally looking at this person next to you on the plane, kind of sizing them up and thinking, am I in a safe place? Is this person okay with me sharing that I'm whatever, married to a woman or, and so, I think that we really, really box people into a corner. Those of us who are straight and cisgender, we move through the world and people will ask us questions and we just breeze through them. Oftentimes, myself included, I don't even realize, how heterosexist the comment was. But it really stops people in their tracks when it doesn't fit for them and when they have to make that decision that we're forcing them into to suddenly come out to somebody.
Yeah, I thought like your book was great for like all these LGBTQ ideas for language. Like my key takeaway was, if a person is gender or straight, we don't use language to point out how different or abnormal that straight person is. But that's what we're doing with lots of people in the LGBT community. And language makes a difference. Like we need to remember that transgender is an adjective, like you say, or to use transgender instead of transsexual, or to use gay instead of homosexual, use typical instead of normal, and avoid, like the word lifestyle.
Right.
Like how do we get the message across that language can make such a big difference to the well-being of others?
Again, I'm going to go back to personal examples. I think anytime that you can share a personal example of impact, it's huge. So if that leader, if we're still talking about a leader in a workplace, can share an example of a time when someone used a wrong term for them, whether it's LGBTQ plus or something completely different, it's very difficult to have people make assumptions about you, use the wrong terms. If you don't have a personal example, and of course, as an ally and a straight cisgender person, I don't always have examples. I share people's stories with their permission. So when I hear like a really impactful story, I ask that person, would you be okay with me sharing this, in a workshop or in a handout? And those stories, again, through the education that I do, those are the things that people remember. People aren't going to remember, statistics or little detailed thing. They remember these stories of how somebody felt. Again, you actually mentioned the silence, which I guess also has to do with language. One of the most powerful stories I've ever heard when it comes to schools and teachers and the impact that they have around silence was my friend Matt, who grew up here in the Rochester area. And he was like, in my school, there wasn't a lot of like bullying or name calling. But he never heard the word, so he's a gay man. He never heard the word gay spoken in a positive way by a teacher or anyone all the way through K through like 10th grade. So here's his identity, and he's never heard this word mentioned. And then, of course, he first hears it in 10th grade in health class. And they're talking about AIDS and HIV. So the first time he hears his identity in school, they're talking about disease and death. And he said, like, it put him so, it restricted him from coming out, from really embracing who he was and being authentic for years.
Yeah.
And he talks about the impact of like, again, sort of as a positive, well, what can we do? He said, if my like third grade teacher had written out a math problem that said, John's two moms bought 5 pizzas, for so many friends, like just normalizing this, just 2 moms in a math problem. He's like, my head would have been blown. I would have, come out and accepted myself so much sooner, just hearing a teacher completely normalizing this gay identity. So again, I think those examples are just, to me, they're the key for helping to educate others on the impact of things like language.
Yeah, like another big issue right now, kind of with a lot of the unrest, focused on discrimination, is the systematizing of discrimination. And one thing I liked about your book was it also gave, clear ideas for leaders to make change. And, I'm just going to note a few of them. One is advocating for professional development. Another one is supporting ungendered spaces, educating the need for inclusive forums and announcements, encouraging participation in national LGBTQ events, and ensuring non-discrimination policies are updated and inclusive regularly. I'd like to hear an example of, if you have one, of organizations taking a knock at changing systematic racism, or not racism, discrimination rather, where they've made positive change.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, here in the state of New York, there was basically regulations came down around ungendering of spaces within schools, which was absolutely huge. So the guidelines were students are allowed to use the facility that aligns with their gender identity. So basically, we're not talking about their biological gender, their gender assigned at birth, their gender identity, what they know themselves to be, they are able to use that facility, which was absolutely huge. I mean, again, just changed the whole climate of school and what's allowed, and really gave the teachers and the school staff the backing that they needed to support this. I mean, it's so impossible to really create change without a lot of times without that sort of sweeping guideline coming in from the state. So they had this backing, and it made a huge impact in schools, allowing students to really access the facilities that they felt comfortable in, that they identified with, which is again so important. And I think just there's so much fear around. It's unbelievable how much fear there is around the bathroom conversations, but single stall, all gender restrooms are just the solution for the future, if you ask me. And they're not transgender restrooms. A lot of people think like, oh, that's the restroom that the trans folks use, right? That's the restroom I'm sorry?
That everyone uses.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's there for everyone. It's there for absolutely anyone. And so, yes, it can be helpful for someone who's maybe non-binary or transitioning or gender expansive, but it's also there. But those folks don't need to use that. We're not telling anyone which box they have to go in. But it's also helpful for people who have a caregiver of a different gender, right? Or for families with kids of different genders who don't want to get separated. I mean, it's so much more comfortable and safe for so many people. And then I also give the example in my book of, like, let's say I work at an organization and I know that my coworker is trans. Maybe she transitioned on the job or whatever. So I'm aware of this, and I don't feel comfortable with her being in the women's restroom. I can go and use the ungendered facility, right? That allows me. We're not going to tell anyone what box they need to use, but to me, that gives me the freedom and safety that I maybe feel that I need. So it just helps people on so many levels, having that choice of where we go pee. Let's just all pee and peace out. It's just like, it's so easy. It's so simple.
Jeannie, if a person or a leader is picking up your book, what first steps should they consider if they want to move towards a more savvy ally mindset?
Well, I think we're very, very hard on ourselves. I know that I am. I will own that. I think that we tend to be very forgiving of others and not very forgiving of ourselves. And I think in some ways, the higher up you get in an organization or agency, corporation, the harder it is to admit that you don't know everything. We've certainly seen that when we do presentations for doctors, principals, folks that sort of have to exude an I know everything persona. And I think that can be really hard. And I think that's one of the first steps is to just allow yourself to be raggedy, which is someone told me that very early on when I started, just allow yourself to be raggedy. And I just love that. Like we need to allow ourselves to be that way and to own that we're going to make mistakes. And I personally think that it shows self-confidence when a leader can admit that they don't know everything and that they're learning. So I think that's I think taking that attitude into starting is really, really critical. Just sort of being open to learning and understanding, knowing you're going to mess up. Again, you rattled off like so many things, like don't say lifestyle, ungendered terms. Like there's so many things that we're invariably going to mess up. And so I actually talked earlier about this. I probably should continue the idea of when we mess up, making an appropriate apology is also really important. And I like to say that that's similar to bumping into someone on the street. So if we bump into someone on the street, we're not going to walk by without saying anything. Well, we shouldn't, because that's rude. And we're not also going to get down on our hands and knees and beg for forgiveness because we feel so awful and sob on their shoes. We're just going to say, oh, I'm sorry, and move on, and then put in the work to get it right next time. But I think people tend to over apologize, and then you're in this weird situation often where the person you just misgendered is now trying to comfort you, which is like, no, how did that happen? So again, I guess I'm just saying, be vulnerable, be open to learning, understand that you're going to make mistakes. I think those are really important.
Yeah, Jeannie, I've really enjoyed our conversation. Just to end, what would be a key message for organizational leaders that they can take away from your book?
Just one?
No, you can do a few. It's fine.
I think that LGBTQ plus people are out there and they're listening. I guess don't get into the idea of well, we don't have any of those folks, which I often hear, or we only have like one or two, right? So about 50% of people in the US, actually, I don't know Canadian statistics, I should look that up. But in the US, about 50% of employees hide who they are at work, are not authentic, change the pronoun of their partner, lie about what they did over the weekend. And so LGBTQ plus people are out there and listening and hoping for that support. And so I guess a big takeaway is create that climate where people can be authentic. Don't wait until you suddenly are seeing more LGBT. That's sort of the reverse, right? Create the climate so that your employees know that they're safe, that they're welcome to be authentic at work.
That's awesome. I love that. Jeannie, thanks so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you for your support. Please remember to click subscribe so we can bring you more remarkable interviews with extraordinary leaders.